So the last speaker before the comment is Amy King. She's a senior lecturer in modern European history at the University of Bristol in the UK. She's the author of the book The Politics of Sacrifice, Remembering Italy's Rogo di Primavalle, that just came out in 24, and which examines the memory of the 1973 attack on a far-right family in Rome and its role in the construction of the far-right identity over the past 50 years. Currently, this book is in translation. It will come out very soon, this year, I think, in 25, in Italian. But there is no title yet, true? No. Yeah. So her research also considers the construction of fascist and anti-fascist martyr narratives in Italian-American communities in the United States during Mussolini's rule, and representations of Giacomo Matteotti's as an anti-fascist martyr during the fall of the fascism and the construction of the new republic. Amy King writes and teaches on the history of memory of the Italian far right over the past 100 years and incorporates creative anti-fascist pedagogy practices into her teaching, which we will also experience now. Her talk is titled Fascism Through an Institutional Lens, how Italy's far right connects to its roots in the anti-fascist republic. And the floor is yours.
I'm just going to start with a minute of a video.
Giovani che ancora credono nella politica, nella militanza, che si battono per le loro idee. Ragazzi di gioventù nazionale, alzatevi in piedi, siete stupendi.
Siamo l'anno.
Siamo galera di migratori. Sono fiera di voi.
Okay. So as you just saw, in June 2024, Baeck, which is the investigative arm of the Italian news platform Fanpage, released its undercover investigation into Gioventù Nazionale, or National Youth, the youth group of Fratelli d'Italia, the political party to which the current Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, belongs. Now, this report dismantled Gioventù Nazionale's facade as a moderate group to expose racism, anti-Semitism, fascist apologism, and indeed celebration of Mussolini. But it also exposed praise for the black terrorism of the anni di piombo, that the years of lead, that long decade of political violence between the late 1960s and the beginning of the 1980s that saw hundreds of people lose their lives in the street, on the train, and in the piazze. And it also showed that Gioventù Nazionale members participated in commemorative events for the far-right dead from that period, from the years of lead. These events, I think, provide young far-right supporters today with an opportunity to present themselves as a continuation of a much longer political tradition, and offers them a chance to engage with the roots of that tradition, fascism, through commemorative ritual and the kind of accompanying iconography that dates back to the fascist regime. I think memory becomes their battlefield and commemoration their act of militancy today. So as you can see, Meloni, well, you can't see, she did take a few weeks to respond. And when she did, instead of actually engaging with what was exposed initially, she just decried the methods that the journalist used as methods that regimes used to use. So in this paper, I'm going to examine one of the central issues that the Baeck investigation raises, which is the contemporary far-right's use of 1970s era memory to engage with its long way back fascist heritage. And this engagement takes various forms, but I'm going to discuss two. The first one is the framing of far-right figures from the 1970s, who themselves had often been connected to Mussolini's regime and as central figures within that regime. But I'm going to think about the way that they're framed as intellectual patriarchs. And the second thing I'll think about is the veneration of the 1970s far-right dead in neo-fascist visual culture today. And these practices allow far-right youth to position themselves as heirs to a tradition rooted in historic fascism through this kind of institutional lens of the 1970s, which is a period itself characterized by violent neo-fascist extremism. and left-wing extremism too, far left. Unlike earlier fascist leaders, though, many of the figures the contemporary far-right reveres from the 1970s operated within the framework of Italy's post-war and constitutionally, at least, anti-fascist republic. So I think we're seeing the 1970s as a sort of filter through which contemporary far-right groups can connect to fascist ideals while circumventing Italy's laws on fascist apologism, etc. So let me start with a bit of an introduction to the Movimento Sociale Italiano for the non-Italianists in the room. This was a party founded in 1946 by former members of Mussolini's Salo Republic, that Nazi puppet state established by Mussolini after fascism first falls, as often called the Italian Social Republic or the RSI. And among the founders of the Movimento Sociale Italiano was Giorgio Almirante, who had been the cabinet chief in the Ministry for Popular Culture during Mussolini's RSI and was deeply involved in its propaganda production. Another co-founder was Pino Rauti, who I will talk a lot about today, unfortunately. And he was a co-founder with links to the Salo Republic, alongside Pino Romualdi, who had been vice secretary of the fascist party under the RSI. So the MSI party was pro-fascism and anti-communism, and it kind of kept the embers of fascism alight in the democratic and anti-fascist republic. We can see a really clear example of the mobilization of kind of historic fascist symbols by the MSI when we look at the way that the party celebrated the memory of Rodolfo Graziani, and I encourage us to read the work of Wiktoria Witkowski on Graziani's memory for more on that. So the MSI was notable, its existence was notable in the context of post-war Europe, where political systems had been designed to encourage consensus and reduce the risk of another kind of authoritarian mass right-wing movement. But as Franco Ferraresi notes, in Italy, the memory of fascism and the sharp class cleavage kept space open for right-wing extremism and allowed the radical right to perform a supporting role in favor of the ruling interests, especially when social conflict was more acute. Piero Ignazzi has worked on the kind of formation of the MSI and its characteristics, and he has demonstrated the political, ideological, and geographic split within the party right from the start. So up in the north, which had experienced the RSI, many of the MSI supporters wanted to see the return of fascism. The party's electoral base formed the kind of second and larger group and adopted a more conservative approach. Reflecting this divide in the early 1970s, Almirante battled to bring the kind of more violent extreme members of the party under control and pushed back time and time again against widespread accusations of organized violence in his efforts to expand the party's electoral base. Despite his efforts, the party's connection to street violence in the early 1970s caught the attention of the national and the international press. Writing in the International Herald Tribune, the US-born investigative journalist Claire Sterling described the scene she witnessed in Milan in April 1973. This event was quickly nicknamed in the Italian press as Milan's Black Thursday, and it saw a banned MSI demonstration led by Senator Ciccio Franco turn violent as young MSI supporters engaged in street violence and clashed with the police, throwing weapons and Molotov cocktails and causing the death of a policeman, Antonio Marino. When those violent far-right youths set off from the MSI base, they were led by important figures within the MSI party, including Pietro De Andreas, who was leader of the MSI's youth division in Genova, and Massimo Anderson, who was national secretary of the MSI youth division. So you'll notice here particularly the presence of youth leaders within the party itself, who didn't perform the violent acts, but were present alongside those who did. According to the conservative paper Il Tempo, the presence of important and powerful MSI figures, which included people like Franco Cervello, commissioner of the Provincial Federation of the MSI, was a signal to those young violent neo-fascists to begin their disorder. Sterling wrote, quote on the screen, "The scenes of that riot, as shown on the national television network, brought back chilling memories of the calculated mob violence that brought Mussolini to power half a century ago." And Corriere della Sera also questioned if Italy was living squadrismo again, dubbing that day the March on Milan, making a clear kind of reference to Mussolini's March on Rome. So, those events in Milan are relevant to our assessment of neo-fascist youth culture today, I think, for several reasons. Firstly, although members of the MSI, representatives of the institutional right, retained some distance from those physical acts of violence that led to the policeman's death, their presence at this demonstration alongside young neo-fascists known to be violent conferred legitimacy on these violent subversives. As Davide Conti's work has demonstrated, the simultaneous engagement of the party with violent extra-parliamentary groups, including Avanguardia Nazionale, Ordine Nuovo, etc., was characteristic of Almirante's more complex physiognomy of his party. Indeed, the party at the time was often referred to as adopting the doppio petto e manganello approach, so the double-breasted suit and the bludgeon. This institutional proximity to more extreme far-right youth groups was also clear in the Baxter investigation of 2024, which revealed the presence of Fratelli d'Italia figures at social events that you saw in that clip, during which far-right youth shout Sieg Heil, chant Duce, 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 and perform the fascist salute. In other words, the institutional right, or far-right, has a strong track record of this kind of proximity and validation. This is important because one of the men investigated in connection to that street violence in Milan in 1973 was Ignazio La Russa, current president of the Italian Senate and one of the co-founders of Fratelli d'Italia, as pictured in this image. As the sociologist Franco Ferrarese notes, the MSI as such cannot be held responsible for neo-fascist terrorism, but it certainly produced a radical political culture, propounding a system alternative that encouraged violence. And although today, on the whole, acts of violence are replaced by reverence of violence, I wonder if we're seeing something similar happening through the proximity of institutional representatives to these more extreme far-right groups. As Luciano Keles aptly reminded us in his recent monograph on far-right iconography, I quote, "References to fascism are not juvenile outbursts, jokey folklore, or Goliardic displays, as some Fratelli d'Italia leaders and their supporters would have us believe. They deserve attention because these young people who so diligently cultivate the legacy of the past are the future leaders of the party." So today, grassroots far-right youth groups continue to revere those who proposed this so-called system alternative put forward by the MSI, which included the use of political violence. These men are now honored as intellectual patriarchs and framed as thinkers, philosophers, rather than leaders complicit in violence. Let's take the case of Pino Rauti, one of the MSI's founders. So he was a former volunteer of the Salo Republic, and he considered violence as a way to precipitate the return of fascism. In 1954, he unofficially founded the Centro Studi Ordine Nuovo, which was formally established in 1957 as a think tank, I quote, for ideological, doctrinal discussion and dissemination of radical right doctrine. The previous year, he, along with 87 of his followers, had left the party to pursue this new order, following the philosophy of Julius Evola, who we spoke about before, and the principles of tradition, authority, hierarchy, discipline, so on. His network extended internationally. He belonged to the right-wing organizations Jeune Europe and Nouvel Ordre et Européen, so a network of neo-fascists ready to use political violence for ideological ends. His group was dissolved in '69, but a militant far-right group bearing exactly the same name, New Order, continued until 1973 and was directly inspired by his thinking and was implicated in several violent attacks from the years of lead, including the '69 bombing of Piazza Fontana, for example. No, keep that up. So, in 2022, just a couple of years ago, Fratelli d'Italia announced its intention to dedicate one of its centres to Pino Rauti, whose daughter is now a Fratelli d'Italia senator. The senator was in Brescia, a highly provocative choice. On 28th of May 1974, a bomb exploded in Brescia's Piazza della Loggia during an anti-fascist protest, killing 8 people and injuring many more. Rauti was tried and later acquitted for the attack. And although he was acquitted, the public prosecutor later declared him morally not reprehensible, he is also that, morally responsible, if not physically. So later, 2 far-right militants, one a member of New Order, inspired by Rauti's think tank, were handed life sentences for the attack in 2015, concluding one of Italy's longest-running terrorism cases. Anyway, in 2022, Fratelli d'Italia explained its decision to dedicate the centre to Rauti. They said in a press release, the decision to name the centre after Pino Rauti was made to reaffirm the continuity of ideals in our political community. Continuing to celebrate Rauti's intellectual contribution to the party, on the 12th anniversary of his death just last year, Fratelli d'Italia deputy Carolina Varchi described him as a man of extraordinary lucidity who proved adept at projecting the best ideas of the past into the future. His writings, she declared, have marked our political path. The future is in the roots. So how then do young neo-fascists engage with Rauti's memory? Well, each year, posters commemorating his legacy appear around Rome on the anniversary of his death, many of which have been collected by Brian and myself and analysed in an online archive that kind of thinks about the visual strategies used in these posters. And these posters, along with the digital equivalents, are widely shared across social media platforms by a range of grassroots far-right groups, some of which are connected to Fratelli d'Italia. These posters represent Rauti as an intellectual forefather. He's bespectacled, he's pensive, his thoughts are worthy of a microphone, the picture of respectability and leadership. And he's presented in the same way on social media posts. His group, it's important to remember, opposed Almirante's perceived moderatism, calling for more. And you can see the quote, andare oltre, in both of the images on the screen. It presented itself as a movement and not a party, trying to intentionally disassociate from the perceived technocracy ruling Italy. And as such, Giovanni Tassani has argued, he wished to attract workers disillusioned with the left, Catholics interested in spiritual and ethical issues not represented by the Christian Democrats too. So what then does Fratelli d'Italia's decision to dedicate a base to Rauti signify, and how can we understand this desire among young far-right supporters to honour him as an intellectual forefather? In both cases, as I said, he's framed as a thinker, a philosopher, and a foundational ideologue. And his contribution, they explicitly state, continues to influence both the institutional right and grassroots youth groups today. This framing is really strategic, I think. It distances Rauti from a central principle of his ideology, which was the use of violence, itself a core tenet of Mussolini's ideology. And it neutralizes his radicalism in that sense. By constructing his legacy in intellectual terms, contemporary far-right groups, institutional and grassroots, are able to attract supporters who revere Italy's violent far-right history, but also appeal to more moderate voters through a visual language, a visual strategy that celebrates ideas of intellect and principles. Right, part 2. If you walk through the neighborhood of Tuscolano, southeast of the historic centre of Rome, you might notice some unusual posters affixed to walls, the sides of shops, and even the frontage of a former school. Different in design, these posters are nonetheless unified by some recurring imagery and the use of a kind of flame-like colourway. They typically include a date, 7th of January, and on that day in 1978, 5 young MSI members headed out from the MSI base in the bottom of this condominium in Via Accalarenzia in Tuscolano to hand out leaflets in Piazza Risorgimento. As soon as they stepped outside, they were shot. 19-year-old Franco Bigonzetti died instantly. Francesco Ciavatta died running up the steps that you can see in the bottom image. And the 3 others turned back and locked themselves inside the base. The assailants fled the scene, other far-right supporters flooded in, journalists, etc. Young neo-fascists threw stones, the police responded, an agent shot his gun, and the 3rd Accalarenzia victim was created, Stefano Recchioni. So today, and some of us went on a little tour of this the other day, the top of the heavy black locked door where Bigonzetti lost his life is partially covered by shutters painted in the tricolore flag. For some, this is a space of patriotism. You can see on the image that a Roman centurion has been painted on the left of the doorframe. He looks right beyond a flaming Celtic cross, which is this grassroots symbol of neo-fascism that was first used by the Italians in the 1970s as they sought to distance themselves from the institutional right. In the run-up to the 7th of January, these posters appear all around Via Acca in Tuscolano, and you also see stickers affixed to lampposts, smaller posters, plaques sometimes pop up and get ripped down. There's a whole host of kind of neo-fascist visual culture that is really unified by this recurring visual language and recurring motifs. And I think it might be useful here to use the work of Peter Jan Magri and Cristina Sanchez Carretero, who think about the creation of memorial bricolage in public space as a way to tie together flowers, graffiti, stickers, posters, monuments, etc., in this kind of coherent memoryscape. A light above the plaque, which you can just see on the right-hand side, ensures that it can always be seen by the hundreds of neo-fascists who gather at this spot each year to commemorate the dead, raising their right arms in a Roman salute and shouting, "Presente." When they do this, they reenact a ritual that originated under Mussolini's regime as part of the cult of fascist martyrs. And maybe we might think later about the particularity of the term martyr. But under Mussolini, black shirt leaders would read the name of the dead, with the crowd responding "presente" to denote the eternal life of the fascist after their deaths. And there's a connection here between political violence and martyrdom, because if you want to encourage people to commit acts of violence and perhaps sacrifice their own lives, you guarantee that they will perpetually be honoured. And this ritual has remained kind of consistent part of neo-fascist memory culture, but it does tend to wax and wane according to the state of the institutional right. To give you a sense of size, this week, 1,300 people did this in Acca. So, as we can see from the photograph taken, it's large-scale events. When they do this ritual, they stand in rows wearing black in kind of rigid formation. I'll just show you some of the posters. This is from last year, but similar stuff happened this year. Thank you. You'll notice that they stand in front of posters showing the number 7, which denotes the date of that commemoration ceremony, the date of the deaths. And such is the centrality of this date in Rome's neo-fascist memory culture today that the number 7 has itself become this kind of recognizable semiotic symbol that you see in and around Rome around the time. That logo, though, evokes a longer tradition of far-right youth support by referencing the logo of Fronte della Gioventù, the MSI youth group, which itself showed this fist holding the flame. Giorgia Meloni joined that group in the 90s. So this is a really much cherished symbol among the far right historically. And as scholars, including Miriam Aouda, have shown, it's an enduring symbol of interwar fascism that points to this kind of fascist death culture and provides a potential space, she writes, for memory investments and emotional projections. So when the MSI dissolved in the mid-1990s and kind of rebranded as Alleanza Nazionale, there was a whole discourse around the place of the flame within the logo, and Gianfranco Fini decided in his efforts to symbolically at least distance his party from the fascist past to shrink that. But in 2022, Giorgia Meloni, there's the MSI one, returned the flame to the center of Fratelli d'Italia's logo, declaring it a symbol we are proud of on social media. So really symbolizing this kind of, or signaling this direct engagement with fascist iconography. To conclude, there was meant to be some slides there from 2025 because some interesting things happened this year, but we can talk about that later. Meloni and her party have frequently engaged with the memory of the far-right dead of the years of lead as part of her calls for the so-called pacification of the nation through memory culture, this euphemistic term that's often used as part of Fratelli d'Italia's broader effort to dissolve that fascist, anti-fascist binary upon which the Italian Republic was founded. Although Fratelli d'Italia members generally opt to participate in the more institutional events earlier in the day, some have attended these neo-fascist rallies, but they don't perform the fascist salute. I'd like to say that, as shown in the Baxter investigation, that's not because of the link to fascism, but because ci sono I giornalisti, journalists are here. So I think what we're really seeing is this intentional proximity between the institutional right and far-right youth groups, like as we've seen in these examples. Meloni, interestingly, last year published a social media post to commemorate the Accalarencia dead, which had the names of the victims on the kind of body of the post, but behind the words was the faint outline of the MSI headquarters in which they died. And I think commemoration is not really about remembering the victims. There's very little biographical information given. What I'm seeing is this intentional kind of reactivation of neo-fascist place as part of a broader effort to embed neo-fascist visual culture and iconography into public space. I'll finish with just one anecdote that I just found out that that Casa Pound just purchased that former MSI base in Via Accalarencia using funds from a fund that has 3 members of Fratelli d'Italia on its board. So, yeah, drop the mic moment.